Hands on the car.
You are making a catastrophic mistake.
Move! Stop resisting!
The Tuesday morning sun was generous, spilling liquid gold over the meticulously manicured lawns of Maple Creek Estates. It was a neighborhood built on the quiet hum of success, a place where the whisper of automatic sprinklers was the most disruptive sound one usually heard. Here, order was not merely a preference, it was the foundational aesthetic. For Judge Elias Thorne, this predictability was a welcome antidote to the chaos he navigated daily in the city's family court. At 48, Elias had cultivated a life as carefully structured as the legal arguments he was renowned for. He was a man who believed in principles, in the steadfast application of logic and reason to the untidy emotions of human life. His world was one of precedent and procedure, a fortress of intellect he had built over 2 decades on the bench. This morning, however, was not about the law. It was about Leo. His 5-year-old son was a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated joy, a delightful disruption to the courtly order of Elias's life. They had just spent an hour at the park, a sacred ritual of swings and slides that grounded Elias more than any legal meditation could. Now, back at their gleaming black 2024 Lincoln Navigator, the final, familiar challenge remained: collapsing the marvel of German engineering that was Leo's Stroller. It was a sophisticated piece of machinery, all lightweight carbon fiber and complex locking mechanisms. Elias, a man who could dissect the most convoluted legal statute, often found himself momentarily defeated by the Stroller's obstinate refusal to fold on the first try. Leo was buckled safely in his car seat, chattering about the velocity of his last trip down the slide, his voice a happy melody in the tranquil air. Elias smiled, his attention on the Stroller's frame. He pressed a button, pulled a lever, and frowned. Nothing. He tried again, applying a bit more pressure. The frame shuddered but remained defiantly open. It was a comical, low-stakes struggle, the kind any parent would recognize. He was a respected judge, a man whose decisions altered the course of lives, and yet he was being outsmarted by a contraption designed for a child. He chuckled to himself, completely unaware of the shadow that was silently creeping into his peaceful morning. It moved with a slow, predatory crawl, a dark blue and white Ford Explorer, its presence as jarring in this serene setting as a scream in a library. The police cruiser glided to a halt about 15 feet behind the Navigator, its engine a low, menacing thrum that cut through the morning's calm. It didn't activate its lights or siren, a deliberate choice that made its appearance feel more like an ambush than an official stop. Elias glanced up, his brow furrowed in mild curiosity. He assumed the officer needed to pass or was perhaps looking for an address. He straightened up, his 6'2" frame draped in a casual but expensive polo shirt and tailored slacks, his standard off-duty attire. He offered a slight, neighborly nod toward the cruiser, a gesture of benign acknowledgement. He had no reason to feel alarm. He was a pillar of the community, standing beside his own vehicle, in his own neighborhood, with his own son. He was, for all intents and purposes, invisible to suspicion. But he wasn't. From behind the polarized sunglasses of the man in the driver's seat, Elias Thorne was not invisible. He was a target. The car door opened, and Officer Kevin Rourke emerged. At 32, Rourke carried himself with the stiff, overconfident posture of a man who believed his badge was a crown. He had been with the department for 8 years, long enough to become cynical but not long enough to acquire wisdom. His supervisors called him a go-getter, a departmental euphemism for an officer who generated a high volume of stops and arrests, often by painting every gray area with the broad brush of probable cause. He saw the world not as a community to be served, but as a territory to be controlled, a landscape of potential threats that needed to be neutralized before they could fester. And as his eyes scanned the scene, the expensive SUV, the man of color, the high-end stroller, his internal calculus of suspicion clicked into place with a sickening, prejudiced certainty. He didn't see a father. He saw a discrepancy. He saw something that, in his tightly wound worldview, was out of place. He began his approach, his hand resting casually, almost possessively, on the grip of his holstered firearm. The quiet morning was over. Officer Rourke closed the distance with a brisk, purposeful stride. There was no warmth in his approach, no "Good morning, sir." His presence was an immediate assertion of dominance. He stopped a few feet from the rear of the navigator, his gaze flicking from Elias to the stroller, then back again. His eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, were impossible to read, but the hard set of his jaw spoke volumes. "That your vehicle?" Rourke's voice was flat, clipped, carrying an immediate insinuation of doubt. It wasn't a question seeking information, it was a challenge. Elias, still holding the partially collapsed stroller, maintained his composure. He had spent his entire adult life in courtrooms, facing down hardened criminals and high-powered attorneys. He was an expert at de-escalation, at controlling the temperature of a room through sheer force of will and intellect. He would treat this officer with the same professional courtesy he expected in his own courtroom. "Good morning, officer," Elias replied, his voice calm and even. "Yes, it is. Is there a problem?" Rourke ignored the greeting. He took another step closer, deliberately invading Elias's personal space. "Seems like you're having a tough time with that stroller," he said, nodding toward the contraption. "Looks pretty expensive. You got a receipt for it?" The question hung in the air, so ludicrously out of place that for a moment, Elias could only blink. A receipt? For his son's stroller? The absurdity of it was staggering. This wasn't a traffic stop, this was an interrogation founded on nothing. He could feel the first flicker of irritation, a dangerous spark he knew he had to extinguish immediately. Leo was watching from the car, his happy chatter now silenced. His small face was pressed against the window, his eyes wide with confusion. This was no longer just about him, it was about the example he set for his son. "A receipt, officer?" Elias said, keeping his tone measured. "This is my son's stroller. I'm putting it in my car after a trip to the park. I don't typically carry proof of purchase for my child's belongings." He gestured slightly toward Leo. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get him home for his nap." He made a slight move to turn back to the stroller, a clear signal that he considered the conversation concluded. Rourke shifted his body, subtly blocking Elias's path. "I didn't say you were free to go," Rourke stated, his voice hardening. "We've had a string of thefts in this area. High-end baby gear, believe it or not. People snatch it from unlocked cars or right off of porches. You match the general description of a suspect." It was a lie, a flimsy and transparent fabrication, and they both knew it. There was no general description. The description was the one Rourke had created in his own mind. A man of color with an object of value in a wealthy neighborhood. Elias felt a profound sense of weariness wash over him. He had seen this narrative play out countless times in the cases that came before his bench. He had heard the testimonies of young men who were stopped for fitting a description that was so vague it could apply to anyone. He had always believed, perhaps naively, that his status, his education, his very position as an arbiter of the law had placed him in a different category. He was wrong. Out here, on this sun-drenched street, he was just another description. "Officer," Elias began, his patience wearing thin, "I can assure you I am not a suspect in any theft. My name is Elias Thorne. I live 3 blocks from here. If you have a legitimate reason to detain me, please state it. Otherwise, I am going to put my son's stroller in my car and take him home." Rourke's lip curled into a slight sneer. The man's calm articulation, his refusal to be intimidated, was grating on him. In Rourke's experience, guilty people either got angry or they got scared. This man was neither. This man was acting superior. "I'll be the one to decide when you can go," Rourke snapped. "Let's see some identification, and keep your hands where I can see them while you get it." The command was sharp, a clear escalation. In the back of the navigator, Leo began to whimper, his small world of slides and sunshine now filled with a tension he couldn't understand, but could deeply feel. Elias's heart tightened. The officer had just crossed a line from unprofessional to cruel. Elias took a slow, deliberate breath. He could feel his heart rate increasing, a biological response to the rising threat. But his mind remained sharp, analytical. He was now assessing the situation not as a citizen, but as a judge. Officer Rourke had not witnessed a crime. He had not received a report of a crime in this immediate vicinity involving a person matching Elias's description with a stroller. His stop was based on a hunch, a pure and simple manifestation of his own internal bias. Without reasonable, articulable suspicion, the detention itself was unlawful. Every second that passed deepened the officer's legal jeopardy. "Officer, my identification is in my wallet, which is in my back right pocket," Elias stated clearly, his voice devoid of emotion. He held his hands up slightly, palms open, a universal gesture of non-aggression. "I am going to reach for it slowly. I am informing you of my every move." "Don't you move," Rourke barked, his own agitation growing. He was losing control of the encounter, and it infuriated him. This man's composure felt like a challenge to his authority. "Just tell me your name and date of birth. I'll run it." This was a small, petty power play. The demand for ID had been made, and Elias was attempting to comply. Rourke's new command was designed solely to frustrate and assert dominance. A more critical failure, however, was happening in plain sight. At any point, Rourke could have simply walked the 15 feet to his cruiser and run the license plate of the Lincoln Navigator. Had he done so, the system would have instantly returned the registered owner, the Honorable Elias Thorne, with a special designation indicating his status as a judicial officer. The entire encounter would have ended with a sheepish, mumbled apology. But Rourke had no interest in information that might contradict the narrative he had already written. He was on a hunt, and he was determined to find his quarry. "I have already told you my name is Elias Thorne," Elias said, his patience stretched to its absolute limit. The judicial steel in his voice, usually reserved for obstinate lawyers, was beginning to surface. "You have detained me without cause. You have refused to allow me to present identification. You are conducting an unlawful stop. I suggest you think very carefully about your next action." That was the trigger. The mention of the law, the calm recitation of his rights, was, to Officer Rourke, the ultimate confirmation of his suspicions. He despised what he called roadside lawyers, people who tried to use legal jargon to trip him up. He saw it as a trick, a clear sign of a guilty conscience. He felt the flush of anger rise in his neck. He was the law out here, not this arrogant man in a polo shirt. "Oh, I'm thinking about it," Rourke said, his voice low and menacing. He stepped even closer, his face just inches from Elias's. "And what I'm thinking is that you're obstructing my investigation." "What investigation?" Elias demanded, his voice finally rising. He could not believe this was happening. "An investigation into a father putting a stroller into his own car? Do you hear yourself, officer? This is harassment." In the periphery, Elias was becoming aware of movement. A woman jogging on the other side of the street had slowed her pace, her head turned in their direction. A landscaping truck had pulled to a stop 50 yards down the road, its occupants watching the unfolding scene. They had an audience. This seemed to fuel Rourke's aggression rather than temper it. He felt the need to perform, to demonstrate his unshakable control. "I've had enough of your back talk," Rourke growled. He looked at Elias, then at the car, a new, more dangerous idea forming in his mind. "You want to play lawyer? Fine. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle. Now!" The command was so disproportionate to the situation that it was surreal. Elias stood his ground. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and righteous anger. "You have no legal basis for that order. You are assaulting my rights, and you are terrifying my child." But Officer Rourke was no longer listening to legal arguments. He was listening to the pounding in his own ears, to the voice in his head that told him he needed to win this confrontation at any cost. He had come too far to back down now. He saw Elias's refusal not as a defense of his rights, but as the final act of resistance he had been looking for all along. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt physical. Elias Thorne, a man who had dedicated his life to the law, stood on the precipice of becoming a victim of its most brutal perversion. He saw the shift in Officer Rourke's posture, the tightening of his shoulders, the dangerous glint in his eyes that was now visible even without seeing through the sunglasses. He knew what was coming. "Last chance! Hands on the car!" Rourke commanded, his hand now moving from his holster to his side, readying himself for action. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, officer," Elias said, his voice a low warning. He braced himself, his mind racing through the legal ramifications of what was about to happen. Rourke didn't offer another warning. He lunged. The movement was sudden and violent. He grabbed Elias's left arm and shoulder, using his momentum to spin the larger man around. Elias, caught off balance, stumbled forward. Rourke used that stumble, twisting and shoving with all his might. The world became a blur of motion and a jarring, violent impact. The side of Elias's face and his right shoulder slammed against the cold, unyielding metal of the Lincoln Navigator. A sharp, searing pain shot through his shoulder joint. The sound was a sickening thud, loud enough to make the woman across the street gasp. The stroller, which Elias had still been loosely holding, was knocked from his grasp. It clattered onto the asphalt, its sophisticated frame now twisted at an awkward angle, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. Inside the car, Leo's whimpering erupted into a full-blown, terrified scream. It was a sound that pierced Elias's heart far more deeply than the pain in his shoulder. "Stop resisting!" Rourke yelled, the words a preemptive justification for his own aggression. "I am not resisting," Elias grunted, the words muffled as his cheek was pressed against the window of his own car. He could see his son's terrified reflection in the glass. "This is assault!" Rourke ignored him. He was operating on pure adrenaline now, the situation having escalated far beyond any semblance of a professional police encounter. He forced Elias's arm up behind his back at a painful angle, wrenching a groan from the judge. He was fumbling with his other hand at his belt, retrieving his handcuffs. The metallic rattle of the chain was a chilling sound. "You're under arrest," Rourke panted, the exertion making his voice tight. "For what?" Elias demanded, his mind still working, still cataloging every violation, every word, every action for the legal battle he knew was to come. "For breathing? For standing on a public street? You have no cause." "Resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, disorderly conduct," Rourke recited, the familiar catch-all litany of charges used to retroactively justify a bad stop. He was securing the first cuff around Elias's wrist, pulling it brutally tight, the metal teeth biting into flesh. From across the street, the jogger had her phone out, its camera lens a small, dark eye recording everything. The man from the landscaping truck had gotten out and was also filming, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Hey, what are you doing? He didn't do anything! We saw the whole thing!" Rourke shot a venomous glare at the onlookers. "Get back! This is official police business! Disperse or you'll be next!" The threat was empty, but it was delivered with enough menace to make them pause, though neither stopped recording. They were witnesses. The entire illegal ordeal was being documented. Elias knew better than to struggle physically. Any resistance now, however justified, would be twisted and used against him. It would be framed as proof of his guilt, justification for the violence being inflicted upon him. He had to fight this with his mind, not his body. He had to remain the disciplined, rational man he had always been, even as his dignity was being stripped from him layer by painful layer. The second handcuff snapped shut. The cold, final click echoed in the morning air. It was done. A family court judge, a man who held the power to dissolve marriages and decide the fate of children, was now a prisoner on the side of the road, his own child, his only terrified witness. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. With his hands cuffed painfully behind his back, Elias felt a wave of cold fury, so potent it almost made him dizzy. It was an anger born not of ego, but of a profound sense of violation. His rights, the very constitutional principles he had sworn an oath to uphold, were being desecrated on the pavement of his own neighborhood. Yet even in this moment of supreme indignity, his legal mind was working, constructing a case, preserving evidence. "Officer," Elias said, his voice strained but clear, ensuring it would be picked up by the recording phones. "You have failed to read me my Miranda rights. This is a custodial arrest. Any statement I have made from this point forward is inadmissible." Rourke scoffed, yanking Elias upright from the side of the vehicle. "You can save the lawyer talk for the public defender, pal." He began a rough, unnecessarily thorough pat-down, pulling Elias's wallet from his back pocket and his phone from the front. He didn't look at them. He tossed them onto the hood of the Navigator with a dismissive clatter next to the car keys he had also retrieved. He was deliberately avoiding the truth. He didn't want to see the driver's license that read, Elias Thorne. He certainly didn't want to see the gold-embossed judicial ID card tucked neatly beside it. To see it now would be to admit his colossal error, and Rourke's ego would not permit that. He needed to complete the arrest, to get Elias into the system where the paperwork and the process itself would validate his actions. "Everyone here is a witness to this false arrest," Elias declared loudly, turning his head slightly towards the onlookers. "You have detained and arrested a man without probable cause, based on nothing more than his presence." "Shut up," Rourke hissed, grabbing Elias by the arm. He began marching him toward the patrol car, a walk of shame past the front of his own vehicle where his son was still crying, his small hands pressed against the glass. The image of Leo's distraught face would be seared into Elias's memory forever. Rourke opened the rear door of the cruiser and, with a practiced, callous motion, shoved Elias's head down and forced him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality, sealing him in a cage. Rourke stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, a triumphant glint in his eye. He had won. He had subdued the arrogant man who thought he was above the law. He looked at the growing crowd of onlookers with contempt. Then his eyes fell on the mangled stroller lying on the street. In a final act of petty cruelty, he walked over, picked it up, and contemptuously tossed it onto the grass verge of the sidewalk, leaving it there like a piece of trash. He wouldn't even grant Elias the small dignity of securing his property. He got into the driver's seat of his cruiser, the leather creaking under his weight. He ignored the faces staring at him, ignored the phones still pointed in his direction. Inside the stifling heat of the back seat, Elias adjusted his position, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but his mind was a block of ice. He was no longer a father. He was no longer a victim. He was a prosecutor again, methodically gathering the threads of the case against Officer Kevin Rourke. He noted the time on the cruiser's dashboard clock, 10:38 a.m. He had memorized the officer's name from his uniform tag, K. Rourke. He cataloged the sequence of events, the illegal stop, the fabricated justification, the unlawful detention, the assault, the arrest without probable cause, the failure to read him his rights, the deliberate refusal to check his identification. He had the witnesses, he had the videos, and he had Rourke's own words. The case was airtight. This wasn't just a complaint for excessive force anymore. This was a federal civil rights lawsuit in the making, a lawsuit that would not only end Officer Rourke's career, but would also expose the rot within the department that allowed an officer like him to operate with impunity for so long. The cold click of steel had not just been the sound of handcuffs closing. It had been the sound of a guillotine being set for a law enforcement career. The drive to the 4th Precinct was mercifully short, a 10-minute journey through streets that Elias drove every day. But from the back of the patrol car, the familiar landscape seemed alien, distorted by the chain-link partition and the humiliation of his circumstances. For Officer Rourke, it was a victory lap. He had the radio turned up, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time with some forgettable pop song. He was already composing the arrest report in his head, weaving a narrative of defiance and suspicion that would cast him as the diligent hero. Suspect was evasive, acted nervously, fit the description of a known offender, refused to comply with lawful orders, became combative upon detention. He would bury the judge under a mountain of fabricated justifications. For Judge Thorne, the drive was a silent, solemn procession. It was the funeral for Officer Rourke's future. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the back of Rourke's head. He didn't speak. He didn't plead. He didn't threaten. There was no need. The damage was done, and the final, irrefutable piece of evidence was about to be handed to him on a silver platter. Rourke, feeling magnanimous in his victory, glanced at Elias in the rearview mirror. A smug, condescending smile played on his lips. "You know," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing advice, "if you people would just learn to be respectful, none of this would have to happen. You come into these nice neighborhoods, driving your fancy cars, thinking you own the place. You gotta learn your place. Show a little respect for the badge." Elias's eyes narrowed. He committed the words to memory, verbatim. "If you people." That phrase, so loaded with prejudice and contempt, was the confession. It was the Rosetta Stone that decoded the entire encounter. It laid bare the ugly truth that this had never been about a stroller or a suspected theft. It was about Rourke's resentment, his bigotry, his need to put a man he deemed out of place back in his place. It was the final, devastating nail in Officer Rourke's professional coffin. Elias said nothing. He simply let the officer's own words hang in the air, a self-inflicted indictment. They pulled into the sally port of the 4th Precinct, the heavy garage door rolling down behind them with a loud clang, sealing them off from the outside world. The manufactured bravado seemed to drain slightly from Rourke in the sterile, concrete environment of the station. This was where the performance ended and the paperwork began. He got out, opened Elias's door, and hauled him out with a rough tug on his arm. "All right, let's go. Watch your step," Rourke mumbled, the perfunctory instruction a stark contrast to his earlier aggression. They walked through a set of heavy steel doors into the booking area. It was a hive of activity. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and officers milled about, their voices echoing off the cinder-block walls. Presiding over the chaos from a high, imposing desk was Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was a precinct institution, a 30-year veteran with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen everything. He was a man who ran his booking desk with an iron fist and a deep-seated understanding of every cop and criminal in the district. He was sipping a burnt-looking coffee and reviewing a shift change report, barely glancing up as Rourke approached. Rourke marched Elias forward, puffing out his chest again, resuming his role for the audience of his fellow officers. "Got one for you, Sarge," he announced, his voice a little too loud. "One under for resisting, disorderly, and obstruction. Gave me a real hard time at the scene. Refused to identify." Sergeant Miller still didn't look up. He sighed, the weary sound of a man who had heard this story 1,000 times. "All right, Rourke. Put his property on the counter and put him in the holding cell." Rourke dumped the wallet, phone, and keys onto the worn countertop. Then he shoved Elias forward slightly. "Here's the prize," he said with a smirk. Sergeant Miller finally lifted his gaze from the report. His eyes scanned over the man in handcuffs, taking in the expensive polo shirt, the tailored slacks, the deep, angry red marks on his wrists. And then his eyes met Elias Thorne's. The entire precinct seemed to fall silent. The color drained from Sergeant Miller's face. His jaw went slack. The pen he was holding slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. He shot to his feet with such speed that his heavy office chair rolled backward and slammed into the wall behind him. "Judge Thorne!" The name was not spoken. It was a gasp of pure, unadulterated shock. A gasp that was about to bring Officer Kevin Rourke's world crashing down around him. Officer Rourke froze, the triumphant smirk melting from his face to be replaced by a mask of utter confusion. He looked from the sergeant's horrified expression back to the man in handcuffs. Judge. The word didn't compute. It was an alien concept that his brain struggled to process. "Sarge, what are you talking about?" Rourke stammered, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "This guy's no judge. He's a— Shut your mouth, Rourke!" Miller's voice boomed through the booking area, a roar of command that silenced every other sound. The authority of a 30-year veteran cop was absolute in this space, and it was now focused with laser intensity on his subordinate. Miller didn't wait for a response. He stormed around the high desk, his movements surprisingly agile for a man his age. "My God, Elias," he said, his voice now filled with a mixture of deference and disbelief. "What the hell happened?" "Hello, Frank," Judge Thorne said, his voice the epitome of calm in the eye of the storm. "It seems your officer here has made a rather significant procedural error." Miller was fumbling at his own belt for his handcuff key, his hands shaking slightly. "Rourke, give me your key, now!" Rourke was paralyzed, a statue of dawning horror. The pieces were clicking together in his mind, forming a picture of catastrophic failure. The expensive car, the calm, articulate speech, the refusal to be intimidated. It wasn't arrogance, it was authority. It was the innate confidence of a man who was not just on the right side of the law, but who was the law. But Sarge, he resisted," Rourke pleaded, his voice now a desperate whisper. "He wouldn't cooperate." "Give me the damn key!" Miller bellowed, snatching it from Rourke's belt himself. With practiced speed, he unlocked the cuffs. Elias Thorne brought his hands forward, rubbing his wrists where the deep, serrated marks of the steel were already beginning to bruise. He flexed his fingers, then calmly reached for his wallet on the counter. He flipped it open, passed his driver's license, and retrieved the one item Officer Rourke had so desperately avoided seeing. He placed his gold judicial shield on the counter. It landed with a soft, definitive clink, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Rourke stared at the badge as if it were a venomous snake. The symbol of the very system he had sworn to uphold was now a testament to his own corruption. "Officer Rourke refused to look at this," Judge Thorne stated, his voice now carrying the full weight of the bench. It was no longer the voice of a citizen, but the voice of judgment itself. "He refused to run my vehicle's license plate. He refused to listen when I identified myself. He informed me that my people need to learn respect. And he did all of this in front of my 5-year-old son." Every word was a hammer blow. Miller turned on Rourke, his face a mask of purple fury. He was not just angry, he was terrified. An assault on a judge, particularly one as respected and powerful as Elias Thorne, was an existential threat to the entire precinct. It brought a level of scrutiny from the district attorney's office, from City Hall, from the Department of Justice that no captain wanted. "You arrested the presiding judge of the family court," Miller hissed, his voice trembling with rage, "for putting his own child's stroller into his own damn car." I thought it was stolen," Rourke whispered, his warrior cop persona completely disintegrated. He looked small, pathetic, a boy caught in a terrible, life-altering mistake of his own making. "Get the captain!" Miller yelled to a nearby officer who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Get Captain Wallace down here right now!" Captain David Wallace appeared in less than a minute, drawn by the urgent summons and the sudden, deathly quiet in his precinct. He was a political animal, a man who understood the delicate balance of power in the city. When he saw Judge Elias Thorne standing free, rubbing his bruised wrists, and Officer Rourke standing pale and trembling in a corner, he didn't need a report. He knew. "Judge Thorne," Wallace began, his face a carefully controlled mask of concern. He started to extend a hand, then wisely pulled it back. I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" "I don't require a medic, Captain," Thorne said, his voice cold as ice. "I require your officer's name and badge number, and I want to file a formal binding complaint, right now. I will not leave this precinct until it is officially logged and I have a copy in my hand." "Of course, Judge, absolutely, whatever you need," Captain Wallace said, his tone one of complete and utter capitulation. This was no longer a police matter. It was a damage control crisis of the highest order. "And one more thing," Judge Thorne added, his gaze shifting to lock onto Officer Rourke, who flinched as if struck. "I want my son's stroller retrieved. Your officer threw it onto the sidewalk on Maple Avenue. I can only hope that while he was busy arresting a member of the judiciary, a real thief hasn't actually stolen it." The sarcasm was sharp and devastating. Wallace turned to Rourke, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, icy tone. "Rourke, give me your badge and your service weapon." "Captain, I can explain." "Badge, weapon, now." The captain's voice left no room for argument. With hands that trembled uncontrollably, Kevin Rourke unholstered his Glock and placed it on the counter. The heavy thud was a sound of finality. He then fumbled with the pin on his badge, the very symbol of the power he had so profoundly abused, and laid it next to the gun. He was no longer a police officer. He was just a man who had thrown his life away in a fit of prejudiced arrogance. "Go to the conference room and wait for me," the captain ordered, his voice laced with contempt. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not use your phone. Your union rep will be called. You are on administrative suspension, effective immediately, pending a full and swift internal investigation." Rourke walked away like a man in a trance, his head down, refusing to meet the stares of his fellow officers. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, pity, and disgust. He had violated the unwritten rule: you don't cross the powerful. But he had done something far worse. He had exposed the department to ridicule and liability, and for that, he would not be forgiven. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By early afternoon, the videos from the bystanders' phones had gone viral. The headline was incendiary. "Cop brutally arrests father in front of crying child for putting stroller in car." It was a damning piece of footage, but it was about to become a national firestorm. By 3 o'clock, a local news reporter had identified the man being arrested. When the world learned it was Judge Elias Thorne, the city's political and legal landscape erupted. The mayor called a press conference for 5 o'clock, standing before the cameras to offer a profuse, humbling apology to the judge and to the city, promising a top-to-bottom review of police training and protocols. Kevin Rourke was fired less than 2 weeks later. The internal investigation was a mere formality. The combination of the bystander videos, his own body camera footage, which he had conveniently activated only after the physical altercation began, and the dash cam audio from his cruiser painted an undeniable picture of gross incompetence, racial profiling, and a shocking abuse of authority. Judge Thorne, true to his nature, pursued justice through the system he knew best. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and against Kevin Rourke personally. He didn't want the money for himself. He won a landmark $6.2 million settlement, every penny of which was used to establish a charitable foundation that provided free legal aid to victims of police misconduct. The true victory, however, was in the terms of the settlement. It forced the city to enter into a consent decree with the Department of Justice. The decree mandated a complete overhaul of the police department's policies on suspicion-based stops, required mandatory ongoing de-escalation and implicit bias training, and most critically, it ended the practice of qualified immunity for officers within the city who were found to have violated a citizen's clearly established constitutional rights. It was a revolution born from a single ugly encounter on a quiet Tuesday morning. 2 years later, Elias Thorne watched from his study window as Leo chased a soccer ball across their backyard. The laughter, once silenced by fear, was loud and free again. The incident had changed him, not in his principles, but in his perspective. He no longer held the naive belief that his position insulated him. He understood now, in a visceral way he never could have from the bench, the terror and helplessness that grips a person when the power of the state is turned against them without cause. He often thought about Kevin Rourke. The psychological profile was, in retrospect, tragically simple. Rourke was a man whose personal insecurities were magnified, not healed, by a badge and a gun. He likely came from a background where he felt overlooked, and the uniform gave him a sense of power and control he desperately craved. He saw the world through a simplistic lens of us versus them, and in Maple Creek Estates, Judge Thorne, a successful man of color who did not display the deference Rourke felt he was owed, was definitively them. His bias wasn't an active, snarling hatred, but a more insidious cognitive flaw, confirmation bias. He decided Elias was a criminal first, and then spent the entire interaction seeking evidence, no matter how flimsy, to prove his initial theory correct. Elias's calm demeanor wasn't seen as a sign of innocence, but as the cunning of a hardened criminal. Could Elias have done anything differently? Perhaps. A different man might have immediately screamed about his rights, or perhaps become overly subservient. But the former would have been twisted into belligerence, and the latter into an admission of guilt. His chosen path, calm, logical, and legally precise, was his only true defense. The lesson learned was a grim one. When faced with irrational, prejudiced authority, your best and sometimes only weapon is unshakable self-control and the presence of a camera. His discipline was his shield. The story of Officer Rourke is a cautionary tale about what happens when personal prejudice is armed with state power. But the real, enduring question that lingers is not about the judge who had the resources and knowledge to fight back. It's about all the others, the men and women who don't have a judicial shield in their wallet, the people who are arrested on a fabricated charge, who can't afford a powerful attorney, and whose lives are ruined by a plea bargain for a crime they never committed. Judge Thorne's victory brought accountability in his case, but has true justice been achieved? Justice isn't about one corrupt officer being fired. It's about creating a system where a man's dignity isn't contingent on his profession or the value of his car. It's about ensuring that no one has to be a judge to be treated like a human being. What do you think is the most effective way to root out bias in policing? Should officers be required to carry personal liability insurance to cover misconduct lawsuits, making them financially accountable for their actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that the badge is a symbol of immense responsibility, not unchecked power, share this story. Let's demand a higher standard. Until next time.